Well, good morning, everybody. So I was asked to try and come up with an approach to estimate potential intake of interesterified fats. I think there's a couple of practical reasons for having this information. One is as we move forward and try and understand the health effects, the health impacts of these sorts of fats in the food supply. If we're going to do clinical studies, if we're going to do intervention studies, we need to have some guidance on how much to feed. So, and this is also how much we're going to be exposed to in the food supply is going to be related to how much trans fatty acids we've been exposed to, because the interesterified fats are to some degree going to be a replacement for the trans. Just as a disclosure of interest, we've done work with trans fats. We have current work going on with trans fats, including fats that are interesterified, but our research questions aren't focused on the role of interesterification. We're using interesterification as a means to deliver specific fatty acids. So I think one of the things to start is to talk about what fats, what oils are available. As Alejandro mentioned and gave some of these same sorts of data, we're going to be using the fats that are available. This is the disappearance data of U.S. edible fats and oils, and I think it's very clear that soybean oil is the king. About 15 to 18 billion pounds disappear from the food supply, and the other edible fats and oils are really dwarfed by the amount of soybean oil in the U.S. So soybean oil in the U.S. is obviously a very important oil and is readily available. These are disappearance data. If we look at, and just on the soybean oil, about 50% of it goes into cooking and salad oils, and about 50% of it goes into frying, margarine, and baking fats. And of that 50%, about 50% of this, so about a quarter of the total, is going in for frying purposes, and about 25% of the total is being used for margarine and baking applications. And you can also see that over the years, starting in 1993 up to 2005, there's been a steady increase in the amount of soybean oil that's disappearing from the U.S. marketplace. If we look at production, we see a similar pattern. Again, soybean oil production, which, as you might expect, is a little bit higher than disappearance data, is steadily increasing in the time frame of 1993 to 2005, and soybean oil production dwarfs the other fats and oils, at least in the U.S. production. Again, soybean oil is a very important potential source of oils. If we look at imports, edible fats and oil imports into the United States, the major imports are coconut and canola. And if you look at palm, you see that, again, it's been steadily increasing and really spiking up in these last few years. So 2003, 4, 5, a real spike in imports of palm. And also note that this is about 1 billion pounds compared to soybean availability, soybean production in the United States, which is running about 15 to 20 times greater than the imports of canola, coconut, palm into the United States. So a big difference in availability. But clearly, palm is gaining some traction and some use in the U.S. It's being imported more readily into the U.S., but soybean oil is still a major player. And this is just looking at the global supply of the major vegetable oils. And again, palm and soy are the number 1 and 2. This is billions of pounds, each with a world supply of 25 to 40 billion, depending on year. The other fats and oils, again, are to a large degree dwarfed by soy and palm. Canola and sunflower seed are up there a little, but clearly palm and soy are the oils that we have available. Production and supply are really critical to what gets incorporated into the food supply. So corn and soy, not corn and soy, palm and soy are what we have available, provide good materials for use. So that's one part of the picture. The other bit of information I think is interesting to look at is to look at consumption of palmitic and stearate over the last few years. These are data from NHANES, What We Eat in America, from 2001 through 2008. 2009-10 data aren't yet available. And this is mean intake for 2-year-olds and older. I think it's interesting that for both of these fatty acids during this time frame, we see a very slight increase. We're talking about 6% of energy. This is percent of total energy, about 6%, maybe up to 6.3% of energy. So it's a very small increase. In the last set of data that we have data for 2007 and 8, we see that it's going back down for both palm and stearate. So it will be interesting to see as the next data come out where this trend goes. Do these continue back down a little or level out? But clearly there seems to be some increase concomitant with the decrease in trans fatty acids that's occurring during this same time frame. So, as I mentioned, estimating the intake of interesterified fats is important because we're going to need to know how prevalent these sorts of fats are in the food supply. It's going to help us make decisions about doing more studies to understand their health impacts. This is a slide that I know many of you are familiar with. I know several of you have data points on this slide. This is the slide of trans fatty acid intake, percent of energy from trans, different intervention studies, changes in cholesterol, red showing changes in LDL cholesterol, green showing changes in HDL cholesterol, and different intakes of trans fatty acids. What I think is important about the slide is that when many of these studies were done, mean intake of trans fatty acid in the U.S. was probably about 2.5–3% of energy. 90th percentile of trans was probably around 4% of energy, maybe a little bit higher, but somewhere in this range. Yet a lot of the studies that we've conducted were at levels of trans intake that were significantly higher. This line here is the estimate of the current U.S. intake of partially hydrogenated vegetable oils from the recent paper put out by FDA, published in February of this year, showing that current trans intake, based on their modeling exercise, is about 0.5% of energy. So it's dropped significantly in the last 10 or 12 years. And I think studies at high intakes of trans or high intakes of interesterified fats are perhaps important, but I think we always have to go back to ask the question, are we seeing unintended consequences of feeding these items, whether it's interesterified fats or trans fats, at intakes that are not going to be achieved in the population? One consideration is trying to feed somewhere around the mean intake of the third quintile, which would be pretty close to what the average intake would be in the population. Or if we want to push up a little bit higher, the mean intake of the fifth quintile. That's going to probably represent high intake for high consumers of either trans or interesterified fats. So those are some potential benchmarks if we're going to be studying these things, what sorts of intervention levels we might want to consider. And maybe fifth quintile is a good benchmark, so that's going to cover most of the people in the population. We like to study at higher levels because it's easier to see a physiological response. We should come back and ask the question, is that really a physiological response? Are those responses clinically relevant? So how do we find out where the third quintile is, where the fifth quintile is? And I'm going to go over some data, and Brent mentioned that this was a project that the ILSI Technical Committee on Lipids undertook, recently been accepted for publication. Brent was involved in the study, Ron was involved in the study, and it was a study to look at potential intake of different fatty acids. And I think it gives us a good starting point to estimate where we might be with interesterified fats. The approach that the technical committee used for this modeling exercise was based on earlier work that was also published in Lipids, one paper in 2006, one paper in 2008. This was a project that was done by Monsanto to look at exposure of soybean oils, in this case low linolenic soybean oil, and what effect would that have on intake of fatty acids in the population. So it was a modeling exercise that was published in Lipids. It was the basis for the ILSI Technical Committee modeling project. And I'm going to go through a little bit about that exercise and use that approach to come up with some estimates on where we might be for interesterified fat intake. So, as I mentioned, we think that the role of interesterified fats is going to be it's going to be a consequence of trans fatty acid replacement. So that's where we're going to start at. So one of the first things to do is estimate what is trans fat intake, and this has been done in the ILSI modeling exercise, and as well recently published by FDA, what trans fat intake is now. Now, their intake that FDA has published really is looking at the consequence of reducing trans fat, but some of that trans fat is being reduced with other fatty acids like interesterified fats. So that's kind of the gap. What we're trying to figure out is we have trans fat intake that's been reduced. Some of that void to get functional properties has been filled with interesterified fats. As I've gone through and we've talked about, soybean oil, SBO, is a major player. So a second step in this modeling exercise is to estimate the soybean content of foods in soybean oil intake. This is done by looking at recipes that are used by USDA, developed for estimating food intake. So you can use those recipes where the commodity groups are broken down. In this case, in this modeling exercise, it was just soybean oil that was considered. This exercise could be expanded to include other oils, but as we've seen, soybean oil is the major player. Once we know the soybean oil intake, then we can look at how that soybean oil is being used. And the next step in this exercise, the third step, is to identify the top trans fat containing food categories, identified as 25 different categories that are likely to be targeted for trans fatty acid replacement. Now, some of those are going to be with interesterified fats, and some of them are not. So this gives us the food categories for which we can look at those categories and make decisions about which ones are going to be interesterified fatty acids, which are probably going to be either palm or steric, palmitic or steric replacement. And really the key here is that it's replacements that are going to have functional applications, functional properties. So they're going to be for baking and not frying, because the frying oils are going to be, the trans fats that were used in frying oils are going to be replaced with some of these genetically improved low-lin soybean oils, high oleic oils, those sorts of oils. So interesterified fats aren't going to show up in those sorts of frying oils. It's really going to be in baking products, and then also in stick and tub margarine, shortenings, other baked goods, yeast products, perhaps popcorn, those sorts of foods. That's where the interesterified fats are likely to show up. So graphically, this is the 25 food groups. Shown in the red bars are, and this is the trans fatty acid intake, percent of the total diet, percent of the total trans fat. So about a little bit less than 20% of the total trans fat in the diet is showing up as cakes, cookies, pies, and pastries. That is an application that's going to be replaced with interesterified fat, shown here in red, as our yeast breads. But if we look at French fries, commercial French fries, that's going to be replaced with a heat-stable oil, a low-lin or a high oleic oil, not an interesterified fat. And you can see the other blue bars here, the heat-stable oils, potato chips, fried fish, fried poultry, other fried products. That's where these heat-stable oils are going to become very important, and there's going to be a few products where there probably won't be replacement of trans fatty acids, but you can see that most of the baking products are going to be replaced with interesterified fats. So not all the trans are going to be replaced with interesterified fats, only a portion to provide that functionality. So graphically, this is what the modeling exercise looks like. There are basically two sides. One are applications that require heat-sensitive oil, the frying applications. The other side are the functional sensitive applications, the baking applications. Those are going to be palm-based solid fats or steric-based solid fats, whereas the heat-sensitive oils are going to be the low-lin soybean oils or the mid-oleic low-lin soybean oils. So this is the area where the interesterified fats are going to start to show up. So the next question is, how much might be showing up in these areas? So the modeling exercise continues, looking at and making some decisions about what sorts of compositions of palm-based oils and fully hydrogenated interesterified soybean oils are going to be in those different applications, because they're going to be different for yeast products versus popcorn. And when it's all said and done, these are the sorts of numbers. This is intake, percent of total energy, and this is for if it were all palm-based replacement or all interesterified fully hydrogenated soybean oil replacement for either palmitic acid intake or stearic acid intake. And the blue bar is the third quintile, the mean of the third quintile, and the red bar is the mean of the fifth quintile. So this would be the extreme. So if all of the application appropriate substitutions were made, so the baking, shortening substitutions were made with palm oil, we would see intakes as a percent of energy about 4.8%. Not all that is necessarily going to be interesterified fats, but this would be the upper limit. If all of the substitution of trans for the application-specific, application-appropriate changes, baking, shortening products, were made with fully hydrogenated interesterified soybean oil, the upper limit of intake would be about 4% of energy. And that would be for the mean intake of the fifth quintile. So these are people who would be eating a lot of bakery products. And this is the sorts of upper limit exposure they would have to interesterified fats. What we really don't know, and what's really difficult to estimate, is how much of this is interesterified fat, how much is it is not interesterified fat. It's a big unknown. So if we look at how much interesterified fat's been used in some of the chronic feeding studies, we're looking at numbers of 8%, 2 to 6% comparisons. So again, we're looking at amounts that are relatively high compared to where we think the upper exposure would be for most of the people in the population. Again, that's probably between 4 and 5%, depending on whether it's soybean or palm oil coming in. So we're looking at doses that have been used that are relatively high. For the other talk I'm going to give this afternoon, I went through Dr. Hayes' paper to look for data. And it's a great review, a lot of information. And I went through it, and finally got to the conclusion. I should have read the conclusion first. But I was looking for data. I was looking at all the studies. And Dr. Hayes' conclusion was that interesterification of fat with SN2 and 18O exerts a negative influence on lipoprotein metabolism at high intakes. It's been shown to affect glucose and insulin metabolism, immune function, liver enzymes in isolated situations as well. And I think the real important statement here is that 2 tablespoons of interesterified margarine will not be detected as harmful. 2 tablespoons of margarine is probably going to be somewhere less than 10% of total energy in the typical diet. So again, we're still in that ballpark. We're probably not going to achieve that. If that 10% of energy, if you look at the energy content that 2 tablespoons of margarine is going to provide, a couple hundred calories, in a diet that's maybe 2,000 calories, that's where I come up with about 10%. Not all that energy is going to be interesterified fat. And we're going to be probably, again, in that range that we talked about, which would be the upper exposure. So we're probably not going to detect this as being harmful. The other part of the sentence, particularly if the fat includes significant polyunsaturated oil, is also really important because we see the introduction of these genetically improved seeds, soybean oil, low lin, heat stable. So we're seeing some potential opportunity where our polyunsaturated fat content of some of these oils is going down, and that would also suggest that our intake could potentially go down. Now, the modeling exercises with that suggest that perhaps they won't, but I think it's something that we need to be cautious about. Any problem will arise, as with trans fats, if IE becomes the process of choice for hardening oils and is consumed in many foods throughout the day. For example, if it fully replaces trans fatty acids in food processing. And again, it's unlikely that it's going to fully replace trans fatty acids. Part of it will replace trans fatty acids, but part of it will not replace trans fatty acids, because those are going to be replaced with the genetically improved oils. So I think this conclusion is really important. I think that the levels that we're going to be at, our exposure levels, suggest that we're not going to detect harmful events. I think we have to be concerned about making sure we have enough poly intake. And I think it's clear that we're not going to have a one-to-one substitution of IE fats for trans fats. So just to summarize, based on the modeling exercise, the amount of interesterified fat consumption would likely not exceed 5% of energy for people who would be high consumers of interesterified fats. Again, those are the people who are going to be eating a lot of pastry products. They probably have some other dietary issues that they should consider. Mean intake of the population, so that mean intake of the third quintile is likely less than 3% of energy. And really the big unknown is of those cut points, 3%, 5% of energy, how much of it is really going to be 16.0 or 18.2 in the SN2 position. That's a big unknown. To answer that question will probably require information from companies or a lot of analytical work. And I think if we're going to try and unravel some of the health effects that we're going to be talking about next, if we're going to start doing intervention studies, we should consider using amounts of interesterified fats that would be clinically irrelevant. And that's how I try to approach estimating how much interesterified fat we might expect to see in our food supply. And I'd be really happy to hear if you have comments or suggestions about how to do a better job. So, thank you.